Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage founder and conference chair of Black Hat, Jeff Moss.
Okay, let's see if this like Madonna headphone thing keeps working. Thank you very much, right over there. Hey, I want to thank everybody for coming. This is the 15th Black Hat. Yeah, I mean, has anybody been here since the beginning? Besides me? No, I mean, any of you guys tough it out with us? Couple? So, this is our biggest Black Hat ever, and I don't know if it's because of the attention we've been getting in the press or the world starting to realize that everything runs on IT or what it is. But it seems like the energy is really back this year. Not just at Black Hat, but everywhere. And I think there's a couple things going on that's leading to that. And, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But first I want to say, for those of you who are new to Black Hat, let me just give you a little bit of the history, since it is 15 years. Back in the day, a long, long time ago, we started Black Hat as this sort of like vendor-neutral, independent conference, and I was doing DefCon, and a friend of mine, Ray Kaplan, said, you know, why don't you just charge a lot of money and get the guys to show up on time, give them materials, feed the people, get some real presentations. And that'd be a little bit, you know, different than DefCon. And I said, you know, that's a really good idea. I should probably do that. But I didn't have the money at the time. And so I waited a year and I saved all my pennies and borrowed some money from Dad and then started it a year later. And that didn't seem to hurt us. We've still grown. It's been really successful. Well, the formula was, I only knew hackers back then. And so who are you going to invite to speak? Well, hackers. And what are hackers doing? They're attacking things and they're defending things. And it turned out that the hackers acted as sort of a proxy for a crystal ball that would tell us sort of the interesting things that are happening in the future. You know, you could turn to these hackers and say, like, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm working on some anti-sniff program to try to detect people who are sniffing the network. Oh, I'm trying this new class of memory corruption attacks. And everybody actually looked at what they were doing and said, okay, if that's what they're doing now, I probably need to care about it 6 months or a year from now. And sure enough, time after time, stories and talks that happened at Black Hat affected the world later. And I think that was sort of our secret sauce. That was our winning formula. And so this year, we're getting back to our roots a bit. Compared to last year, we have less tracks, more tech. And to try to keep that tech edge going, we started a review board. Many of you might have noticed we've got a lot of leading experts now on our review board trying to help us churn through 200, 300, 400 submissions to try to distill it down to some of the best ones. So this is the first year you'll see the results of that. And also the tradition of Black Hat is that you're supposed to challenge the speaker. It's not supposed to be somebody preaching to you. It's supposed to be more interaction. So if you're a tech guy and you think what he's saying is incorrect, just say, hey, wait a minute, I don't think it works that way. And that will be good because we don't want misinformation going to the audience, and we want everybody to be on their toes and feel like, it's a learning experience. And so if they're telling you about a tool and the tool isn't free or the tool's not on the CD, there's not supposed to be any vendor pitches. This is meant to be applied and practical information that you can get excited about, take back to your organization and use the next day. And that's another thing that I've always tried to keep Black Hat different and special is that there's no vendor pitches, or there shouldn't be any. And if there are, you got to let us know. And you can do that with the feedback forms. We actually pay attention to all the feedback forms, and people get rewarded. We have a random selection, and you get free admission to future conferences, and lesser prizes as well, based on your feedback. And we take that stuff seriously. So I did a quick printout. I do this every year. Who are all the new people? How many people here is this your first year at Black Hat? Raise your hands. So a lot of you guys. But I'm betting you're probably, there's one person representing Bulgaria, Costa Rica, Croatia, Kenya, Mongolia, New Zealand, Serbia, Vietnam, and the United Republic of Tanzania. And as you can guess, America is the #1 representing, closely followed by Canada, the UK, Sweden, Australia. A lot of people from Israel, though. And we got some Argentinians, France in it with 20 people, Germany in with 34, Japan 23 representing this year. It's pretty good. Canada in with 116 people. So there's a couple of trends that I want to point out. It seems like with all the public awareness that's been going on around security, it's like we've got this great mirror, right? We can look into it and see anything we want to see in it. You want a story to talk about data loss prevention? We got that. You want to talk about web app sec? Okay, we've got that too. Disaster recovery, business continuity. You've got more than enough stories now to explain to your management how security isn't necessarily a scary thing, but we can be a business enabler. If you involve us sooner in the decision-making process, we can help you. But if you only call us after the house is on fire, you have very few options. And one of the realities that seems to be coming out of this is that there's this assumption now that you're compromised. Stop fooling yourself. It's probably better to assume that you've been compromised and plan accordingly than to try to convince yourself that you can always 100% keep everybody out. And I think with that new reality, we'll be able to sound more realistic. And the other thing that's interesting that's happened since last year is the United States published its international strategy for cybersecurity, or for cyberspace. And so that makes the US the first country to publish a national document that lays out our sort of policy goals. What do we stand for as a country online? And I'm hoping that that will lead other countries to do the same thing. So when the US is, say, talking to the United Kingdom, we know what the United Kingdom stands for online, and France, and Germany, and the EU, and South America. And then pretty soon, we can start figuring out where we have commonalities, and then we can start coordinating and working together. And so instead of us all being little balkanized islands on the net, we can start coordinating where there's common interests. So for example, I think every country in the world has a societal norm that child porn is bad. Pretty much everybody agrees spam is bad. So those seem like two really good starting points for us to work together. And then maybe that's a confidence building exercise, and from there we can work toward organized crime or phishing or money laundering. And the final point I want to bring up is compared to last year when I talked a bit about the internet getting a foundational upgrade with DNSSEC and IPv6, and that's pretty much all happening now. Between last year and this year, we have run out of vForce address space, and DNSSEC is signed in about 90% of the routes of the TLDs, and that's covering about 90% of the, or 80% of the internet's traffic. So what can you do? Well, I think there's a herd immunity or a network effect going on where the second level TLDs now need to start signing their zones, because once we get enough people, enough critical mass with signed zones, then the whole internet actually starts to get the benefit of the technology. And so I'm looking to 2011 and early 2012 to be the year where we start convincing a lot of second level TLDs to sign. I mean, I didn't have enough time to sign BlackHat zone before we came out here, but I signed the DefCon zone. It took a day for me to puzzle it out, and once I figured it out, it took me like 5 minutes. So I think the barriers to entry are pretty low now. So if you don't have a corporate policy or strategy to sign your zone, you should think about it. Because you're not only going to be helping your own organization, you're going to be helping the rest of the internet. And that's something you can feel good about. Okay, so I want to remind everybody, tonight, after the last talk, we have our reception. It'll go for about an hour and a half. And then we have the Black Hat circuit, which is on the 3rd floor, 1 floor down. And it's a bunch of different rooms themed in different styles, drinks and nibbles. During this reception, we're going to have the Pony Awards are back. Hacker Court's going on, and that's something you can just take your drink, take your food, sit in there, check out the talks, and see who's winning the Pony Awards. I hear a rumor that Sony's in for one of the. I hear they're in for one of the awards. I also want to thank the Black Hat team for putting on a great conference this year. It's the largest ever. Logistically, it was kind of difficult, so I want to thank Ping and Eric and Travis and Patty and Steve, Franny, and all the ops crew and Kathy. And I also want to thank the speakers, because without the speakers, we would not be here. And if you think about it, organized crime's not telling you what they're up to. They're keeping quiet. And nation states who are busy breaking into each other, they're keeping quiet. They're not telling us what they're up to. And the vendors certainly really don't have that much deep insight. Or if they do, you're always a little suspect of their motives. But the researchers, they're the ones that are really talking publicly about this. And so I always get concerned when I hear that some of there might be pressures to try to muffle speakers, muzzle them from talking, because that would hurt us all as a community, because they're one of the very few people that are actually talking out loud about what's going on. And so we had a near brush with one of our speakers who was talking about some SCADA security issues, and instead it turned out the vendor was very adult about it. They're understanding. They worked with them to try to push out a patch very quickly. And it could have gone completely the opposite direction, and instead it didn't. And I think that's a sign that the vendors are maturing. They don't have a knee-jerk reaction so much when somebody comes forward and points out a flaw in one of their products. So I want to thank the speakers. So now I'd like to introduce Philippe Courteau from Qualys, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Kofor Black. I've known Philippe for years. He's been very active in the security industry, and a long-time sponsor of Black Hat, one of our cornerstone sponsors. But 10 years ago, he started Qualys as sort of a managed security service, security as a service. And I guess now we would call that a cloud service. But back then, they didn't have that word, so it was a managed security service. And it's been doing very well ever since. And so I want to thank Philippe for his long-standing support of believing in Black Hat, and introduce him to say a few words. We'll introduce our keynote, Kofor. So with that, I'll see you guys around, and I'll see you at the reception. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, good morning to you all, and Jeff, thank you for this very nice introduction. I think it's a real pleasure to see how Black Hat has grown, and I would say well, and continuing growing. I think we are today about something like 8,500 people have registered, for Black Hat, which is impressive. And to me, I think Black Hat is very special, and it's very special because I think, unlike many other places where we talk about security, I think at Black Hat we live it. And this is something which I believe creates the value. In fact, as we all know, we're just at the beginning of the internet age, and security has now become center stage. So I believe that it's only with a strong, cohesive, and committed community to security that we can rise to that tall order of securing the internet. And as Jeff mentioned, signing our zone, this maybe seems little things, but it compounds. So I think this is a very unique moment for all of us in security. I think, as Ed Cullinan says, the chairman of the CSA, that we now have the opportunity to have a seat at the table. One CSO told me that today, when he wants to convince, his board or CEO to spend money on security, if it's about the old infrastructure that he needs to protect, he thinks in terms of insurance. But when speaking about new services that the company wants to bring to market, then he speaks in terms of ROI and saying we need to build the security into our model up front. And that's what I think the very big difference. So with that being said, I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker. I think this is a man which I think exemplifies the commitment to security that we all have. This is a man who has an internationally renowned expert in counterterrorism, spent 28 years at the CIA as, in fact, a curriculum that it's for me too long to go and tell about. But with that, I'm very honored to introduce Ambassador Kofor Black.
Good morning. I had first heard of Black Hat a couple of years ago, and looking out here I can see that you, and since this is my first one, we are legion. I'm going to try and tell you a story that I think is important. Certainly the 10th anniversary of 9/11, which had significance, profound significance for the United States as well as all reasonable countries overseas. I'm having a little bit of a flashback, Twilight Zone moment here. And the reason for it is the last time that I was on a stage almost identical like this, with the screens on the wall with, my face, and there were exactly 4. It was on the 5th of August, 2001, and it was a Defense Department conference, it was classified. And I gave my spiel about the emerging threat, the threat of terrorism. Where I'd like to end up with this is a validation of what you do and who you are is so very important. There's almost a transference from what I experienced and what I did in my career to what you are doing now and what you will do in the future. On the 5th of August, same stage, I was thinking, geez, with a show like this, I should have a guitar in my hand. Got up on the stage, and I can't sing. And at the end of my talk, I told the audience that there's going to be a major attack. Thousands of Americans are going to die, and it could be in the United States. So, same setting, same screens, different audience, but the same type of environment and threat for the future. What I'd like to do is I'll start to talk about the evolution of what I experienced. I'm not going to say it's absolutely sort of a God's eye view, but I'm pretty sure of what I'm going to tell you as I was there. I'll go through that. And then I'll try and make a connection to what you're facing, what you're up to, and where we're going with this. None of this is going to be easy. I certainly don't understand many of the technical parts, but I do have an appreciation of how decision makers view what are the issues and crises of our times. Like technology and the world that is evolving with you, as how many black hats you've had, the counterterrorism era started in very much the same way, my experience, and all of this is public knowledge, there's no real secret, but the putting together of this and giving you insights might be useful for you to validate and look at what you do with technology and where you're going. I spent 28 years in the CIA. I was from 1993 to 1995. I became very familiar with Al-Qaeda. I was assigned as a chief of station in Khartoum, Sudan. We did almost exclusively counterterrorism. There was only one assassination attempt against me by Al-Qaeda. And it was a very productive time for collection, to collect and report. Despite what seemed to be a very growing threat, sort of terrorism, Inc., there was a bias to view Al-Qaeda as basically, and Osama bin Laden in particular, as a funder of terrorism overseas and not as much an initiator himself. Afterwards, after that tour, I became the head of counterterrorism for the CIA, which actually in its time, since the issue was somewhat smaller than it is today, we had a pretty wide area of responsibility. We were responsible for all finished intelligence and went to the President and the Secretary of State and all of that. We were the focal point for the intelligence community that turned into the NCTC. We were responsible for all human and technical collections overseas, and we were responsible for all covert action. We did this with a very small group of people and not that much funding. The world, and certainly the United States, viewed terrorism as a function of being sponsored by states. And, the list was significant: Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Sudan, North Korea, Cuba. The fixation was on that. So the bilateral approach, trying to talk them out of that. The array of assets that the United States had at that time was pretty limited. Technology is very much in the same way. It is ramping up, and I think we all will be surprised in 15 and 25 years where your world ends up, analogous to where my world of counterterrorism wound up. The U.S.'s premier law enforcement agency, the FBI, absolutely great. They were encumbered by a law enforcement model. After 9/11, they became more preemptive in intel collection, and I think their efficiency became even higher. Oddly, the U.S. military, and to quote the chairman of Joint Chiefs in the 9/11 hearings, the U.S. military did not do counterterrorism. It did anti-terrorism. It was concerned about things like posse comitatus and the like. So, you know, the CIA and certainly the counterterrorism people in it sort of writ large. We were primarily concerned about things that had killed a lot of people, such as Hezbollah. Al-Qaeda was seen as sort of a financier that was growing over time. Those days, like technology today, was escalatory. When I took the job in June of 1999, an esteemed colleague, expert on Afghanistan, was writing editorials saying that, you know, this thing with Al-Qaeda is way overblown. In fact, the United States should send out a memorandum to the Taliban saying, we promise you we'll never attack and let's negotiate. A year later, in the summer of 2001, the media was concerned about shark attacks. There was either inability to come to terms with us or a denial. There are, and we'll get to the end of this, sort of analogies to technology. In the Middle East, you think people that would actually be very knowledgeable about this. In my wandering around the world, the approach was basically, hey, this is our patch, we know what we're doing, don't worry about it. In East Asia, it was seen mainly as a criminal thing. These are criminals, such as, you know, they are credit card thieves, so how could they be terrorists? Europe had just come out of a long engagement with the Cold War. The wall had come down, the Soviet Union had gone away, and they had an extreme difficulty validating that this was going to be a threat to them, possibly the United States, but certainly to them. The Russians were concerned about Chechnya, and Latin America basically revolved around Colombia and the FARC. This activity went along until about 1999-2000. You'll remember the Y2K business. Most of the fixation was on this. In the counterterrorism area, we had a thing called the Millennium Threat. You may remember this also to be where a terrorist came across the border in the west coast of the United States, Rassam, went through a checkpoint, jumped out of his car, ran away. The FBI would call that a clue. They grabbed them. They found out there were explosives. And there was validation of the effort that had gone into this. In the Situation Room, as this was going on, I remember the head of the FBI said, so Kofor, what's the probability of U.S. targets being struck? It's 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10 and probably 15 operations. Many of these were stopped, certainly outside the United States against American targets. One huge one was in Amman, Jordan, and that was stopped and we went on our way. There was one operation that never was consummated. This is all connected, and unfortunately, it's going to wind up with you. So there's a track to this. The attack that was launched in Yemen against a U.S. Navy ship called the USS the Sullivans did not succeed. The terrorists didn't do their homework. They overloaded the boat with explosives. It sank. They ran away. The Sullivans went through. And in fact, we didn't know anything about this. When it was be October, a year later, we'd have the USS Cole, and the same personnel, the same resources were used against that. The Cole action was significant because obviously attack had taken place. We were able to prove very quickly that this was Al-Qaeda, but the demand for validation that the orders had come specifically from Osama bin Laden took quite a while to do, too long, about 4 or 5 months. Validation of threat and attack will come into your world. The administrations that engaged this subject, the Clinton administration went through 8 years. Their appreciation of this was escalatory. There were issues involved with this. At transference to the next administration coming in, the Republicans, and I was at the meeting, the view was the Democrats said, this is the greatest issue that you're going to face. And I think the Republicans, new administration coming in, wasn't too sure. They wanted to research this, wanted to take a look at it. And it took them a while to validate that this was true. There was a lack of appreciation of the threat this was going to be. And in hindsight, there's a lot of confusion, the reality of how these things went. The transference in time was not really fixated on this threat. We were interested in more things like ballistic missile defense and the like. But the process went on. We came towards the summer of 2001. And in this was an increasing volume of intelligence that we were developing that was shocking and haunting. It's another thing for technology. Over time, as you identify problems and threats, there is a delay to validation that indeed this is a great problem. Reports were written in the President's Daily Brief that Osama bin Laden was determined to attack the United States. Every senior official in the United States government was briefed personally. And the worst of these times, I think, turned out to be represented by a non-scheduled meeting that we requested. And I went to George Tenet. Our guy came in with the latest threat briefing. It was really bad. My feeling would be if any of you were presented with this type of intelligence, you'd say this is an extreme threat. Action needs to be taken. So presented this to the CIA director. We went forward, went to the White House, met with Condoleezza Rice, gave the presentation, looking for validation that we were all going to move into action as a follow-on to all the briefings we've given to the various different agencies. Men's minds have difficulty adapting to things for which they have no personal experience. And that's why I think things like Black Hat are so significant, to identify, develop technology, but also to be advocates for where this is all going and to help people to develop an appreciation of where to put resources and what to do. At the end of the meeting in July, I was asked, what should we do? And my response was pretty dramatic. This country needs to go on a war footing now. We continued to move along in this pace to collect. There were some threats that were stopped. And at the same time, the counterweight was there were articles and editorials in newspapers saying you have a greater chance of being killed by a bee sting than you do by a terrorist. This al-Qaeda thing is greatly overblown. It was reflected also, I think, in the leadership of this country. But if you wish to say, well, the Americans were slow, they were comparatively quicker than our partners overseas. I know of no nation overseas that had validated this threat certainly as much as the Americans, although we would have liked that we could have done more. People say, were you surprised when 9/11 took place? And I can tell you that neither myself or my people in the Counterterrorism Center were surprised at all. And in fact, it was sort of a strange validation that what we had been anticipating, major attack, thousands of Americans dead, and the information we had behind that, had indeed taken place. What was shocking was the loss of life, yet at the same time, I guess it could have been a lot worse if you look at how many potential occupants there are in the towers, and we went forward with that. I will tell you, from my perspective, our people were psychologically prepared. They knew they had to react and respond. And in the technology world, you may face similar issues in the future. But the rest of the establishment was not. There had not been appreciation. This was a real threat. They may have to do something. And so on the morning of 9/11, I was seated in my office and looked at the TV screen, and the plane had flown in one of the towers, and my office manager came to me and she said, the plane flew on towers. It was a small hole. I didn't really think too much of it. As the captain of the USS Cole, remember the U.S. warship that was attacked in October before, came in to pay a courtesy call to say, hey, thanks for the support that we had provided in support of the FBI to Ship and his crew. As he came in, the phone on my desk rang. It was a colleague of mine who had was very familiar with military things, and said, hey, we've got a big problem. I was watching the plane fly in the tower, and the problem is that I could see the control surfaces moving. The pilot was flying the plane into the building. As he said that, he was in New York, he said, I'm evacuating my position. There's been another impact. And at that point, it became very clear that this had started. It was a very chaotic time. And again, at the end with technology, the chaos and the confusion can be a great inhibitor to sort of clear action in a linear way. We very quickly participated in responding to this crisis. But the advantage that we had, we'd been working on this for 2 years. We knew this was going to come. We were as prepared as we possibly could be. And we had two basic things. We had the Afghan war plan, and we had the worldwide attack matrix. The Afghan war plan was basically a covert action initiative that had been coordinated in paper that was never released, which basically would project into Afghanistan to engage Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The other piece of this was what we call the worldwide attack matrix. Sounds very draconian, but it was basically operating, and I forget the exact number, but Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's affiliates, supporters, about 95 countries, and to engage to protect innocent men, women, and children. They would be things like, calling up the guy's mother and saying, hey, you have to get a grip on this guy. Obviously, if they're determined to fight, that would be something else. As the day went along, the CIA director said, we have to clean up this plan. We dusted it off. We had it the next day, and then we started the whole process rolling. Met with the president. And the amazing thing is, in crisis, the entire bureaucracy drops away. All of the inhibitions we'd ever had to get more money, more people, to get people to listen to us, absolutely all dropped away. It was like the clouds opened up as a result of a catastrophe. Sort of sunlight comes in, and there's a pretty speedy approval process of how we were going to approach this issue. We had plans, we were ready. The Defense Department, again, according to General Myers, this was not their thing. They weren't as ready. Meaning at Camp David and the rest, we got the nod, went forward, and we proceeded. And I will tell you, I've had the greatest life of challenges and opportunities, and I think one of the most profound things I ever had to do is meet the men that were the first that responded with the initial waves going into Afghanistan. They were very small teams. They were extremely brave. It was sort of like the OSS in World War II. These people were to fly in on our helicopters that had been pre-positioned in advance, and would fly in at night and set down a certain coordinate and get out and link up with locals, but these things don't necessarily always go right. Before this started, I went to the director and I said, you're the one that's going to have to make the call on this, and my expectation is we're going to have anywhere between 40 and 60 of our people killed. It could be really bad, it could be on TV, and the essence of this is there can be no hand-wringing, no self-recrimination. You have to respond quickly, immediately send in another team. And some of these moments in history, and he was looking at me chewing on a cigar, thought about it an inordinately long time, and he said, okay, go. So this went forward, had a good plan, meanwhile doing the other things around the world. The technology, people responded very quickly in terms of the kit and everything they had to provide. They went in, there was never more than 110 CIA people on the ground. Eventually they lashed up with about 300 special operators that had the capability to bring in the ordnance. The essence of it was a plan. It was a plan that basically appreciated why men fight for prestige and honor. This is their land. They'd been invaded by foreigners. The foreigners in this case were the Al-Qaeda people. They had money. They were taking the resources. By this time, they were not well liked. So our story was, we have been hurt. We've lost a lot of innocent men, women, and children. We're coming in to assist you, to rid you of these people. And it went marvelously. Within 10 weeks, all the cities in Afghanistan had fallen. The link up between the allies that we had developed in Afghanistan went well. And we had supplied them with something like 1.69 million pounds of supply. You had a contrast between very high technology, and you had operators riding on horses with wood saddles. It was an effective blend of two cultures over time. There was bold leadership on the ground. It was something that we're all very proud of. We had called the threat, we had warned, we had this catastrophe, and these same people under this situation of extreme psychological shock responded extremely effectively and won what I think is, to their credit, one of the quickest, most cost-effective victories without collateral damage. But all stories don't necessarily end well. And one of the thoughts that I and my colleagues have always had is that with such success over time, we were able to locate very precisely Osama bin Laden and his last 250 guys in December. We knew it since late November in a place called Tora Bora. And it was after a considerable campaign of the Air Force dropping bombs and the like, we requested that conventional forces be put in to block these guys. And this was presented very stridently, unfortunately, and briefed to the appropriate authorities personally. They did not do this. And I've always thought it'd be extremely unfortunate. I've asked a lot of people involved in this that viewed it from other viewpoints, and no one's ever really come up with an answer. Any of the ideas that the intelligence wasn't accurate or they didn't have the forces, I don't necessarily think hold up. So what was a great story wasn't really consummated at the end, and it's one of the regrets of my life. I mean, this the President of the United States, way above my pay grade. I would only see him rarely. In fact, before 9/11, I never saw him at all. But we were able to present this information to him, but I just wish that we could have underscored that even more, and action could have been taken, but it was not to be. The intelligence was good. The technical intelligence was exceptional. And one of the reasons was that we had recovered on the battlefield one of the very short-range radios used by an al-Qaeda member communicating with Osama bin Laden. We had a linguist translator there, had been working on this for 8 to 10 years, knew it well. It had a range under ideal circumstances, about 5 miles, so in the mountains it's less. So it had a pretty well dialed in, had a lot of human intelligence, yet it was not to be. There is an analogy to this as we go forward in the technical world. I must tell you that the situation in the world that you face may even be more challenging than you appreciate. And I don't even understand all the technology, but here we are at the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Osama bin Laden has been rendered to justice. Our decision makers are saying that al-Qaeda is in a position of strategic defeat. And Secretary of Defense Panetta says that there is an expectation of imminent collapse. If you look at my life, which was started out in the Cold War, the concern was nuclear annihilation, and we were able to move through that, essentially, plus or minus, transformed into a global war on terrorism. And guess what? It is now your turn, whether you really know it or not. The issues that you are involved in terms of attack and defense, are taking a value among decision makers that is huge. I was just at the Aspen Institute talking to General Hayden and the like, and we were talking about this, and there is no one that disagrees with this. Many of you may know about the mantra, and this is when I was in counterterrorism, the letters are CBRN, if you take away nuclear war and things like that. CBRN stands for the likely probability of a terrorist attack and the means that would be used. CBRN, chemical, reasonably easy, could be expected as the highest probability attack. A bacteriological, very bad, second probability. Third is radiological, taking dirty equipment, put it up, blowing a bomb. Last is nuclear. Some people say nuclear is the largest threat, maybe the largest threat, but it's not the most probable. So in the scheme of things, until very recently, it was kinetic, like Mumbai. Multiple coordinated kinetic type attacks. Chemical, bacteriological, radiological, nuclear. Now, it's your turn. This has now changed. You have nuclear weapons being drawn down. Everyone's negotiating, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, hoping all these loads of yield come down. The new letters are now KBC. Kinetic, most probable and still, coordinated attacks blowing stuff up. Bacteriological, very scary, more conceivable now than it was before. You have the prospect of considerable loss. And the third, it's now your turn, is C, and not for chemical, for cyber. my world of terrorism has gone from 9/11 type attacks to something that they're on the ropes, that could have defeat. So their posture of response is likely to get smaller. Things like the DC shooter, individuals empowered through radicalism, another big issue, is significant and small. With appreciation, with small, you must have media impact. The biggest thing, and I should warn you, I know something about technology. I spent 2 years as a freshman and sophomore in college majoring in electrical engineering. Of course, the end of which, the 2 years, the professor took me aside and said, you better find another major before you get in an impossible grade point situation. So I moved on to something else. But I have a little bit of an appreciation of it. And the biggest thing in my world of defense of innocent people, and something that's really probable, and I thought there's some shady rat thing or whatnot. This is your world. I don't know much about it. But I am here to tell you, and you can quote me, and everyone that I've talked to I think is authority, is the Stuxnet attack is the Rubicon of our future. I don't necessarily understand exactly how this was executed, but the important points are it was really expensive, probably, so a nation state had to be involved. That's factor one. Factor two is your world, which people just thought it was, college pranks cubed and squared, now has morphed into physical destruction. Physical destruction of from the victim's view, of a national resource. This is huge. The next thing is that what is the potential response for something like this? Department of Defense has come out, and this is almost as huge, saying that an effective attack that has physical ramifications and destruction brings in the viability of kinetic counterstrike. Boy, hold on to your seat. I can see myself in the Situation Room having been on the receiving end of a technical attack with physical dimensions and sitting in the Situation Room saying, okay, what now? What happened? Who did it? What are we going to do? And I could really see this. Randomly pick somebody in here, and you're trotted in as the expert. Like I told you, electronics. I'm usually not of a mind to continue presentations when the klaxon horn's going on. Just let's hear what this says. All I can say, having spent a year in the CIA, coincidence? Just follow my lead, stay calm. Do you guys want to take a vote? Do you want me to keep on going? All right. I think in, what is it, Crimson Tide, the commander says, shut that damn thing off, anyway. So here's the analogy. Here you've got situation of Tora Bora. You have a clear identified target dialed in. On the other hand, in the future, you have a cyber attack, physical damage, and you have the issue of what happened, who did it, response. And you have Department of Defense, the US government, saying that it's not ruled out that a kinetic response should be taken. This is a very delicate window into our future. Like I said before, Cold War, global war on terrorism, and now you have the Code War, which is your world. From old to recent passing to new, cyber will be a key component of any future conflict, whether it's with a nation state, with rogue state, or with terrorist groups. 9/11 was kinetic. The idea was to preempt, deter, and to defeat. In my world of terrorist groups, the natural inclination will be for Al-Qaeda to fall back into things that are small and agile. They will enter the cyber world because it's comparatively remote. It's comparatively safer than strapping on a bomb. So you have these things coming together, and your world is one that, hey, I'm talking here, okay? So that's basically the story. What you do is important. You have my attention. Thank you. I want some free chips for the gambling table. That's what I want. Okay, am I making myself clear? Career in the CIA, developed Cold War, global war on terrorism, escalatory nature, threat seen, not understood, not validated. It was new to decision makers. They didn't understand, you know. There are aspects that I can go into more revealing, but it's unnecessary. Didn't really come to grips with it, had no personal experience with it. The decision makers of today are still sort of in that boat. They hear it, but they don't believe it. That's kind of the terrorism world it was in. Also, the connection between cyber, physical destruction against national entities, and then the difficulty of identifying who's responsible and an appropriate response. I am sufficiently knowledgeable to know that in my world, the concept is false flag. Everybody wants to look like somebody else, so they can't be blamed. In terrorism, this is done exquisitely, such as the Iranian government. They knew exactly what our rules and regulations are. They'd have surrogate groups, so to make sure what happened, that in our legal system, they could not be put in a situation of being retaliated against. That's where you are, and it's fraught with danger, because at emotional times, remember President Clinton launched cruise missile strikes into Afghanistan and also against the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum. Hey, that's where I spent 2 years. They should have asked me. I could have told them. It's a pharmaceutical plant. Confusion comes up in normal course, and I think in your world it's likely to be accelerated. What you do is important, and we are all in this together, and we're counting on you. I admire your intellectual achievements and inquiry, and looking around here, I'm sure that we have every reason to feel confident that you will meet these challenges and that we'll all be better off. Thanks very much, and thanks a lot for the announcements.